All right, take your Bibles and join me in the book of Philippians, if you would. Chapter 1, Philippians chapter 1. Want to continue the series. We're going to and speak to you on the subject of knowing Christ, knowing Him. Really, that I may know Him and the power of His resurrection, the fellowship of His sufferings. And so let's start out this morning. Let me just walk you through a little bit of our review. What kind of world do we live in today? We began to talk about that last week. What kind of world do we live in today? And we said a couple things. We said, first of all, it's a messed up world. It's basically the conclusion that we drew. We live in a broken world. We live in a messed up world. Reading this week, just a little bit of what's taking place in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and all that. And they literally said, just Christians are being killed. Christians are just being beheaded systematically, including little children. And hundreds of them are just being killed. So you have to say we live in a broken, messed up world today. But we also experience that because of our own condition, our own sinful condition. Each of us struggle with the issues that we face and the issues that we have because of the sin that still resides in us. When I was a kid growing up, I'd ask, Dad, can I do this? Dad, can I do that? And the answer would be sometimes no. And then I'd ask what all those teenagers or kids always ask. The next question is, well, why, Dad? And the answer was always the same. He'd always quote the Bible. He says, for I know that in your flesh dwelleth no good thing. And he was right. He was right. And the songwriter would always say it, prone to wonder, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. It's a struggle to continue to walk in faithfulness to God, to walk in obedience to God. It's just a constant ongoing battle that each of us face because not only we live in a broken world, in a messed up world, but we ourselves experience elements of that brokenness as well. But for those of you that know Christ, you experience the grace that He gives to enable you to walk through it. So we said this, it's a world of conflict and wars. It's a world of lawlessness, it abounds. And it's a world where there's a consumer mentality that is just prevalent wherever we go. What can I get? What can I get? How does it benefit me? That's just the world we lived in. So we began to ask the question then, what kind of church do we need to be? Which really boils down to what kind of individual do I need to be? What kind of person, what kind of Christian do I need to be in the midst of this world? Because the bottom line is that God put you here to minister in a broken world and to make a difference in the settings in which you live and the settings in which you work and in which you play. God wants your life to make a difference. Because if you've experienced this salvation, then you have experienced the healing that He gives. And in turn, He wants to use you to introduce Christ so that they too can experience His grace, His mercy, and His love, which we sang today in some of the music and some of the words that you sang. So what kind of church? We said, first of all, it needs to be a church that is surrendered or that is submissive to God's work in and through us. We talked about that last week. That He who has begun a good work in us, He will perform it. This is not a testament of our achievements. This is a testimony of Christ in us, doing His work through us. And He who began that good work in your life at salvation is going to perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Isn't that exciting? And so there's an element which we submit to that will. Not my will, but your will be done. The second thing we said was we're a church committed to the defense or the confirmation of the gospel. And what he means in that passage is simply this. There are times we defend it. One of the things you defend today, evolution is obviously big. The Bible doesn't hold the concept of evolution. It teaches creation. So we defend that. And it's defendable. Scientifically, it's defendable. But ultimately, it comes down to faith, because whatever you believe, whichever system you follow, you accept it by faith. And so what? Faith in what? And we defend it. Then we confirm it. How do we confirm it? By our lives, by the way we live. And we said last week that if someone watches your life is going to say the exact same thing that the Bible says. And whether they read the Bible or whether they read you, they're going to get the same message, right? Yeah, we said the Bible's kind of perfect. We're kind of messed up. Right, that's okay. Because what happens is you sin, but what do you do when you sin? And that's as great a testimony, is when I do sin, when I do mess up, I come to Christ and I ask for his forgiveness. And if I confess the sin, then he's faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And I think what people need to see today is not perfection, but they need to see a Christian who just lives out the reality of their Christianity by a life of holiness and a life of just living, recognizing, hey, I'm a sinner, I sin. If the Apostle Paul stood up here today, we'd have a fight, because he would stand up and he would tell you this, hey guys, I'm chief of sinners. And I'd say, no, you're not, I am. And all of you should stand up and say, no, neither of you are, I am. And that would be the conversation that went down here today, that in this building is the meeting of those who recognize their sinfulness, recognize their need of God, and have come because he is the one who rescues us from our ruin, and he gives us his grace in place of our guilt. Isn't that awesome? And so we confirm the gospel, but we're also a church that is willing to endure hardship for the sake of the gospel. Well, let me just put this in context for you and fill in some details as we go a little bit further. Why does Paul introduce this concept to us? The answer to that question is because if you look at the life of Jesus Christ, this is Jesus Christ. He was the one who submitted to the cross. He did say this, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. So when you talk about submissiveness and surrender to God's work and God's will, the ultimate example is none other than Jesus Christ. When you talk about committed to the defense and the confirmation of the gospel, Jesus went to the cross to put the gospel, put the final period on the gospel and make it what it needed to be, because it was his blood that cleanses us from all unrighteousness. And he was committed to that. We sat in a conversation this week and someone said this, Christ didn't die for you. He died for God. He did what he did, not first and foremost for you. He did what he did first and foremost for God. You benefited from it. But Christ satisfied the anger of a holy God against all unrighteousness and all of our sin. And Christ made that ultimate sacrifice for the gospel so that God's wrath would be satisfied. So when he looked down at you, he didn't ever look at you with wrath. He looked at you with mercy, and he looks now at us with grace. Why? Because Jesus Christ was willing to surrender himself, go to the cross, confirm the gospel. And what you have in Jesus Christ, you also have a church that was willing to endure hardship for the sake of the gospel. And Christ endured the cross. And so now you take it a step further. You take it from Christ, and now you come down to the Apostle Paul, and you begin to study the Apostle Paul's life, who writes this book of Philippians from the prison and writes to this church. So Paul understood the reality of being surrendered and submissive to the will of God. Paul was saying, I don't want to be in jail. Sitting here in this place isn't what I pictured when I gave my life to Christ. But he's sitting in a jail, so Paul is surrendered to the will of God, willing to accept it, and because of that, at midnight there's the earthquake. The thing opens the gates. The Philippian jailer runs in thinking that all these prisoners had escaped. He's about to take his life, because if all the prisoners had escaped, the Romans would have taken his life. And Paul looks at him and said, do yourself no harm, we're all here. And as a result, that Philippian jailer and his family comes to Christ. And Paul later, they baptized those Philippians. Acts chapter 16, you can read the story. But Paul proclaimed the gospel, and Paul was in jail writing this, so you see this in the life of Christ, you see this in the life of Paul. But let me tell you what your life's going to be like as a Christian. It's going to be constant surrender to God's will. It's just ongoing. And our life is this, not my will, but your will. And sometimes God takes us through circumstances that we don't ask for, we didn't want. Some go through cancer, some go through financial stuff. There's things that take place in your life, and there's things that occur in your life that you didn't want, you didn't set out to get. In fact, if possible, you run the other direction. Who of us wants to go to a doctor and say, hear that, dreaded C word, you have cancer? But you can't prevent it. Any more than certain circumstances in your life, you can't prevent. And so it's like, okay, God, I live in your hands. I always think this. I always think between trust and obey, I'll take obey. Because when it comes to obedience, you're in control. When it comes to trust, you got to take your hands off the wheel completely and trust the one who is in control of your life. And then through that is how God has built his church. Through these three principles right here is how God has built his church over the years. And I'll tell you, if we live long enough to watch what's taking place in the Middle East, you watch what God does. Because as we said before, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Watch what God does when his people are willing to take these three principles and say, this is the kind of church that we need to be. Willing to surrender to his will, willing to commit to the defense and the confirmation of the gospel, and willing to endure whatever hardships that come our way. And good night, guys. We've had hardships come our way as a church. We didn't ask for them. We don't always want them, but we can't control them either. But through it, when we're surrendered and when we understand, that's how God builds his church right there. That's the kind of church we need to be. And if we're that kind of church, then do this. Watch what God will do. Now, let's go on and what do we need to do in this world now? Let's just process this concept. All right, we know what we're supposed to be, but what are we supposed to do? And now in these verses, that's what Paul begins to deal with. So he says this. He said, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. In other words, what he's saying there is my imprisonment has advanced the gospel. And to tell you, your hardships advance the gospel more than your good times. That's just how it works. He goes on, he says, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Then he goes on and he says this, some indeed preach Christ through envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter, the goodwill people, do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former, those who preach out of envy and rivalry, proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. He said, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in that, I rejoice. So we ask the question that what do we do in this messed up world? As a believer, as an individual, okay, we know what kind of church we're supposed to be. Surrendered, committed, and willing to endure hardship. Now, what is it that we do as a church? Let's just probe that, because I think that's what the scriptures teach us. First thing is we share Christ. Paul says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So that it has become known. What has become known? The gospel has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. I think what Paul's referring to there is those guards that guarded that prison, and to all the rest of the people that were in the prison with him. Everybody in that prison knew that Paul was there because of the gospel. How did they know that? Paul. So we share Christ. That's what we do. Jesus said it this way in Matthew chapter 19, or in chapter 4, verse 19. He said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." So what's Paul doing in that jail? He's fishing for men. So wherever you put Paul, put him in Athens, and he shares the unknown God. Put him in a prison, and all the guards and all the prisoners are going to know about who? Paul? They're going to know about Christ. Wherever you put him, in whatever setting you put him, you're going to find out about Christ, because Paul's life is all about this. I'm fishing for men. I proclaim Christ. That's what we do. That's what we do. We proclaim Christ. Now, if you follow this, we share Christ in any situation we might be, despite the hardship. We share Christ. That's what we do. I don't have to convert you. I don't have to get you to make a decision for Christ. I don't have to rescue you. I don't have to fix your situation. I can't. I share Christ with you because Christ can fix you. Christ can save you. Christ can heal you. Christ can release you from those addictions. Christ can help you to overcome that sin that does so easily beset you. Christ rescues, we don't. The biggest relief in my life as a pastor years ago was to realize I don't have to get anybody saved. But I need to make sure that you know who Christ is, because Christ can save. And he does. He still does. He still is. And he's still rescuing. And he's still doing that work of sanctification in your life. Because he who began a good work in you is going to complete it. I don't do too good at that. I'm the kind of person that starts something, but, finishing is another thing. I can get stuff started, but for me, finishing is the difficulty. I wrestle with that. You know what Christ never wrestles with? He who began a good work in you will complete it. It's Christ. So your task isn't to get people saved. It's just to get people aware that there is a Christ, and there is grace, and there is salvation. And he does love you. And he wants to rescue you in your condition. And you know who he rescues us from? Ourselves. Because our tendency is to put ourselves as God and say, I want to live my life the way I want to live it. And I'm going to do what I want to do. And so Christ saves us first from ourselves and says, I've got so much more for you. So much more for you. If you can just see and you could just trust me, I have more for your life than you could ever imagine. But you set out to do it your way. You set out to have yourself be your God, and you set out to do the things that you want to do and this and that. How's it working out for you? See? We share Christ in any situation. So you guys, when you go out to your little leagues and take your kids to play little leagues, you don't have to share the whole gospel message, and please don't ever jam anything down anybody's throat. But take advantage of opportunities that God gives. I often think this, and this, I just keep thinking in these terms. Just build relationships with people. Just build relationships with people where you're willing to be a friend. If they never come to Christ, still be a friendship there. Listen to them. Because what will always surface in a friendship setting, and I've found this so true, what always surfaces in a friendship setting, if you're willing to listen to them, is the pain that sin has caused in an individual's life will always surface. Man, I'm going through a hard time with my kids. I don't know what to do. Got teenagers now, and I'm not sure how these teenagers just want to do what they want to do. And man, how do you, and all of a sudden the pain just begins to surface. Sometimes in these settings today, I don't know if I want to have a job tomorrow. I don't know if they need me anymore. I could get laid off tomorrow. Who knows? That will always surface in friendships. And just listen. And as you have opportunity, you begin to share what Christ has done in your life. And I'll tell you, if you ever take time, sit down and just begin to write out, count your blessings, name them one by one. And it will surprise you what the Lord has done. Just begin to count the blessings that God has given you in your life. And just see. You got out of bed today, didn't you? Yeah? You didn't need any assistance, right? That's good. So far today, you've lived vertical, right? Your car made it here today. You had breakfast most of you this morning. My daughter was at the house today. I got up, she made me eggs and bacon. Wahoo! With cheese in it. Protein. Helps with the blood sugars. See? So already today, the blessings are they're just all around us. My granddaughter, I'm standing out in the foyer today, my granddaughter came around that corner. And when she saw me, she lit off and ran to hug me. That's a good day. I don't care what else happens today. That's a good day right there. See? So count your blessings and then realize, yeah, there are hardships. We all go through them. And you all have your struggles. And you all have your difficulties. But in the midst of it, we learn that Christ is there, Christ is there, Christ is there. So we share Christ in any situation, whatever it might be. Let's think it through. What else does the passage teach us? Well, the second thing it teaches us, rejoice. We rejoice whenever Christ is proclaimed in spite of who or how it happens. Listen to the verses. It says, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. So there's what he begins to introduce us to two kinds of people, which is kind of interesting. He said there's these people out there sharing Christ, but this group of people does it with the right motivation, and this group of people over here, they don't do it with the right motivation. These out of goodwill, these out of envy and strife. So he introduced us to these two different groups of people. And then Paul comes down and he says this, the latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. I am put here in prison for the defense of the gospel. Because of my proclamation of the gospel, I landed here in jail, and everybody knows it. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, with the right motivation or without the right motivation, he says, I rejoice because Christ is proclaimed. And he says, I'm going to rejoice whenever and however Christ gets proclaimed. I rejoice. So we rejoice whenever Christ is proclaimed in spite of who or how it happens. I had a friend stop and see me last week. I told you about it. A friend of mine named Tamale. He moved to California a while ago. And Tamale's not his real name. I sure hope there's a mom that doesn't name her kid Tamale. I hope there's none of you in here that named your kid Tamale, or I'm being a lot of trouble. Tamale stopped in to see me, and Tamale's one of them guys. He and his wife moved to California, and when they got to California, they ended up going to a church out there, and his wife came to Christ. And I was mad. All I said is, God, I worked with those people. I invested and poured and gave my life to help them see Christ and understand the gospel and get the gospel. How come you took them to California and someone else gets to lead them to Christ? Why couldn't I do that? That's aggravating, isn't it? No. I'm glad she came to Christ. Do I wish I could have had the opportunity to sit with them in that time? Sure. But I'm glad somebody had the opportunity to sit when she came to Christ. And whether me or whether you or whether somebody else, whether Faith Baptist Church or whether some other church, we ought to rejoice that somebody came to Christ. Don't look and say, that church, I don't, yeah. No. My attitude toward any other church isn't, We rejoice in what they do, knowing that they proclaim Christ. And in that, we rejoice. And we would hope that they rejoice when we have the opportunity to proclaim Christ too, right? So you see, Paul says this, we proclaim Christ, so however he gets proclaimed, we're just going to be glad that he gets proclaimed because people are going to hear about Christ. And that is the bottom line. Now, I want to take you to go a little deeper. I want you to think with me through this thing because let's ask this question, why does Paul write this? Because we know what he writes. You've all read it. Some of you read it, Philippians 100 times. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible, a book about joy. But why does Paul write this? It's in this text why he writes it. I want you to see it. And with this, we'll close. He writes, first of all, to encourage you, because when you share Christ in the midst of your situation, you embolden others to share Christ. You do. Your life, Paul writes to encourage you, because when you're willing to share Christ in the midst of hardship or whenever you share Christ, the result of that is that the person sitting next to you or the person sitting around you or the person watching you that you even know is watching you will be emboldened to share Christ as well. Paul said it this way, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. I'm not sure who all those brothers are. It may be those that are in prison with him, but I would doubt that. My guess in this passage is that the brothers are those that saw Paul's ministry in Philippi, saw all this took place, and knew that as a result of what Paul did and what Paul said, that he ended up in prison, and then knew what happened in prison when the Philippian jailer came to Christ. And what happened is those that were viewing Paul's life were emboldened to share Christ as well. And that's what happens with you. There's nothing more encouraging than things that happen on Sunday. When I come here Sunday morning, and some of you will come up to me, and you'll just tell me about opportunities that God has given you during the course of the week to share Christ. Man, you don't know, but it's like taking one of those old-fashioned iron workers, what do you call them things the things that bellows? It's like taking a big bellow and just blowing that air on the fire. When you share that with me, that just lights my fire and say, I just want to share Christ more. I want to share Christ more. Because I know what Christ has done in my life. And if he does anything in your life like he's done in my life, you're going to love it. But it may be painful along the way at times too. When you live out your Christianity and the reality of it, you encourage others to live out their Christianity as well. And so I want to encourage you to be a person who commits to sharing Christ, the defense of the gospel, the confirmation of the gospel, because not only do you impact those that don't know the gospel, but you impact all those that know the gospel around you to be able to step up and say, I'm going to get involved in this process. And I'm going to make sure that as a result of my life, that other people will know who Christ is. And that's why he writes. And you sense that in him. You sense in this letter that Paul just loves these people. You sense in the book of Philippians the love between Paul and these people. He loves this church. And I think this church in response loves him. And he just has this church focused. And he wants to keep them focused because one of the things that takes place over the course of time is this. And I can tell you this in our own church. When a church begins, it's reaching out, it's reaching out, it's reaching out, it's reaching out, it's reaching out. All of a sudden there's a group of people come, you say, we got to grow them, and it reaches in, it reaches in, it reaches in. And that's deadly to a church. A church has to have a reaching out and a reaching in. And it has to be in proportion to each other. So do you need to grow as a Christian? Absolutely. Do we as a church need to commit to helping you grow in your walk with God? Absolutely. But the other thing we do is we encourage you to go in the world and preach the gospel to every person. Share Christ. Share Christ. Get out there and let Christ be known through your life. How you do that? Listen, that's going to look different with every person you come in contact with. When I started riding with the motorcycle guys, you don't go up to a motorcycle guy and say, let me tell you about Christ. Yeah, let me tell you something. Gotcha. The motorcycle guys aren't the kind of guy who jam anything down anybody's throat. They'll jam something down your throat, right? Did a funeral the other week, or a year ago, did a funeral for one of the Warrior Watch guys, and a bunch of pagans. Remember the old motorcycle group, the pagans? They showed up in their gear. The pagans. First time in my life I met a number of pagan motorcycle riders. Funny thing is, they're all in their 60s now. Well, maybe not funny, but you old hotshots got old. And but you really don't. How you share Christ with a pagan motorcycle rider? You might want to think about how you do that. Because he won't get very far through the Roman road of salvation. You just won't get far with him. There are other people that you meet that you can take very far. But you have to learn what is the depth that a person can go and how far can I go with an individual? How much of Christ can I share at this time? Because if you share too much, you may never get another chance to share. They need to know that you love them before you're able to input truth into their life. They need to know that you care about their life, because if they know you care, then you enter into a new realm. I'm not saying that there's a balance in this thing that I've learned. It's not that we don't share Christ. We do share Christ. That's what we do. But how we do that. Now let me show you the second reason he gives us. Paul writes to challenge you, because Satan will use other Christians to attempt to discourage you. Look at this passage. He writes, the latter do it, the latter proclaim Christ out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. Now watch this, verse 17. But the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. In other words, they're saying, nah, we're glad you're in prison. So there were other Christians who were rejoicing in Paul's imprisonment. I would hope that if I get put in prison this week for a good cause of sharing Christ, that you're all not sitting out there saying, yes, yes, he went to prison. Are so glad we're trying to get rid of him anyway. That's what they were saying about the Apostle Paul. We want to get rid of him. So they're like, yes, he's in prison. Now we're going to do, and we're going to share the gospel. And what you get in this passage of Scripture is in this church at Philippi, you got Christians who aren't getting along with Christians. Now, I just go along and say this. That would never happen here, right? I mean, when you come in here, the love just flows out of this place for everybody, right? There isn't anybody in here that would be critical of someone else or wish them evil or glad that they're in prison. There isn't anybody in here like that, right? Can I tell you this if you don't know it? That the greatest source of discouragement in your Christian life is not going to come from people out in the world. It's going to come from people in the church. And so I got to ask myself the question, where am I? And I got to take Paul's challenge to say this. Who am I wishing evil on? Or who am I being contentious with? Or what issue am I driving? And where am I in this? Because the bottom line is this, is we ought to say to each other, are we proclaiming Christ? That's the issue. And my friend, that is the only issue. Well, great. If you like that, that's great. But are you proclaiming Christ? Well, great. But are you proclaiming Christ? I got to tell you what I've found in my experience over the years, and we'll quit with this. My experience is this. If you gripe about stuff, you're probably not sharing Christ. Because if you get out in the world and you begin to wrestle with the things that they're wrestling with, you realize that there really are no issues in the church. The issues are out there. When I make issues in here other than proclaiming Christ, it's probably because I'm not proclaiming Christ and I'm seeking for my own identity. Because my identity is I proclaim Christ, and if I'm not doing that, I got to find identity in something else. And usually, that's what creates conflict. So there's a challenge that comes to all of us today. And the challenge is Satan uses other Christians to attempt to discourage you. So do this. Do me a favor. Don't ever let another Christian discourage you. And don't ever let another Christian stop you from proclaiming Christ and doing what God wants you to do. Because they will be all around you. I have a book in my office. It's called Restoring Your Spiritual Passion. Read it years ago. I kept it in my office because there's a section in it that identifies people. There's VDPs, there's VIPs, there's VDPs, and there's different, he gives different. VDPs are very draining people. Very draining people. They sap the spiritual passion out of you. There's others, VIPs, they ignite spiritual passion in you. Over the years, I've been a part of this church. I look at it this way. When I joined the church as a little kid, I formed a marriage, and I never wanted to get divorced. There's never going to be a perfect church, no matter where you go. My dad used to say, if you find it, don't join it, you'll wreck it. I look at it this way. I'm in a marriage. I don't want to get divorced. But do we have problems? Yeah. But I'll tell you what will solve most of those problems if we're willing to just love each other. But if we do this will do if we keep the focus on make Christ known. That's the issue. So I end with this. Jesus just said it this way, and I end with this challenge to all of you. Go into all the world and preach the good news to everyone. And that's what Christ said. And that's what Paul reiterates to the Philippians. And through the message in the book of Philippians, he reiterates to us, make Christ known.